Hey everybody, Jeremy here from Nobot Studios. Welcome to another Grit Fantasy RPG video. Today I'll be talking about turn order. This is a topic that I touched upon in other videos that I've done, but I felt like I wanted to do a turn order specific video and get in there and talk about how it works in Grit Fantasy RPG. I'm going to start by talking about the traditional initiative and turn order setup that you find in a lot of games. Kind of go over some pros and cons, and then get into how Grit Fantasy RPG does it, and also do some pros and cons, and maybe a couple of pointers. So what I mean by traditional initiative and turn order is something that you would find like in D&D, where you when you get into combat at the start, you make a initiative roll around the table and determine the order of operations as far as characters and monsters or GM is concerned. Okay, highest usually goes first, lowest usually goes last, and then you just round after round follow that order. Okay. You find this in all kinds of games like, D&D, ICRPG, Pathfinder. I've played tons of systems with this. There's a reason why it has stayed out there for so long. It's because it works. Okay? I am not here to bash it. I'm just here to kind of show the difference between this traditional style and what Grit Fantasy offers. Okay? So some of the pros to this. It is familiar. So if you've played one game with this setup, you're going to be able to walk into another system and just understand it, right? There might be some variances in how things are done. Like ICRPG, you can actually do a round the table kind of thing. So you start with the person on the left of the GM and go all the way around the table. That's fine too. I have run things like that on VTT, which I just basically look at the badges across and I just go in that order. A lot of times what I did, I would make the initiative roll at the start of the session and just use that throughout the whole session. So there's different ways to run it. But yeah, that's the biggest thing, or one of the biggest things, is just that it's familiar. It's predictable. That's another thing. It puts it in a very logical order. You know exactly who's going when. This can open up tactical planning. So after an initiative roll, once combat gets started, the table can get together and kind of figure out what they're going to do as a group. This doesn't always have to happen. It doesn't happen every game, but it's possible for it to happen in that way. That way they know, okay, the, big burly barbarian is going first, and then followed by the cleric, followed by the thief, blah, 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 right? So it can, for people that really like that kind of tactical arrangement, it can really work well for them. Okay. So some of the cons that I've noticed from playing these games for so many years is that it can promote complacency. You could take your turn and then you just check out, and wait your 20 or 30 minutes or more until your next turn. And I think it can be slow in that way. Especially with a more complicated system, you can kind of do your cool thing, and then you just kind of sit back and don't really pay attention to the rest of the combat. As much planning as you want to do, sometimes you can't do planning because the things change so much. If you have a lot of players in particular, that can, the table can change so much that you really can't do any kind of planning until you get to your turn or close to it. With fewer players, this is less of an issue. I also find it to be somewhat unrealistic as far as how combat would actually feel. It's very static, I swing a sword, next person casts a spell, next person shoots a bow, then the goblin gets to do a thing, and then the orc gets to do a thing. It's very regimented, and to me, it's almost too unrealistic and predictable. And another big thing too is that it kind of, depending on how you set it up, it can divide the gameplay into non-combat and combat. So like you could be doing your cool non-combat narrative kind of stuff, and then suddenly combat starts happening, and then you all have to stop, roll initiative, set up all the turn order. People have to check to see, what their initiative bonus is or whatever. That can totally kill the mood and the flow of the game. It can work inversely though. You can get into that like, oh crap, something's happening. We got to get, let's roll initiative, and then everybody grabs their dice and they're off and running. But more times than I would like to admit, to me, it just like kills the flow of what's happening in the game. So that to me is just kind of the cons, right? And so to get into Grit Fantasy RPG, it works differently. There is absolutely no initiative roll, and there is no set turn order. Okay. There's a couple places this is written in the rules. So on page 8 is the first time it appears. So this is in the basics section of the core rules. So basically, sessions of Grit are played over a series of rounds. There's no combat rounds, there's no non-combat rounds, it's just rounds, okay? So everybody gets a turn to do something. There is no set order to this. You don't roll initiative, like I said. They're taken more freely as a collaborative type of thing each and every round, and the GM is part of that. Now the GM plays a role in prompting sometimes, depending on the players. But the only real rule is that the last person or GM, player or GM, to take an action, not a reaction, cannot be first in the next round. Okay, so you can't like take your turn at the very last part of the round and then start the new round and then you take your turn again. So this kind of breaks up combat, or breaks up the rounds a little bit too, makes sure that it's not the same all the time. And I don't think I've had many at all that work out the same exact combination of players or characters and the GM round after round. It's always mixed up, which is really nice. The other place you see this, which kind of just basically says the same thing, is on page 13. Okay. So each combatant takes one turn per round. You can take an action or reaction, not both. And then combat just ends when one side is defeated, escapes, or surrenders. So what makes the combat rounds move so quickly, and what makes it actually work with this style of turn order, is the use of the action and reaction. Okay, so it's just always this back and forth of a character's doing something and then the GM is reacting, or the GM is doing something and a character is reacting. It's like, it happens so quickly. You can move through an entire combat round with like 3 or 4 players in 10 minutes, or maybe 15 minutes at the most, instead of like, quite a while to do a full round, which could be, 20, 30, 40 minutes in a more traditional setup. There's variations on this, of course. There could be very efficient players in the traditional setup that just move through it quickly. But basically, Grit Fantasy RPG just moves so much faster, and it's more organic feeling. Okay, so that's one of the pros. It just feels more organic and engaging. The players don't know what's going to happen round to round, or even turn to turn, so they're more engaged in what's happening in the combat. Okay. I think this really promotes participation in what is happening in the game. There's not a lot of downtime for people to kind of like space out or whatever. So that helps. And like I mentioned, it's just really fast. It just feels like second nature after you've done a few combat rounds. If you're new to the system, it may take a game or two to kind of get this. But once you get used to it, it's like, wow, I kind of don't want to go back. This is kind of how I feel after playing so much Grid. When I go into a traditional kind of setup, I feel like kind of, I don't know. It just doesn't feel right. It feels kind of just too predictable, too regimented. I guess that's the right word. Okay, some cons to this. If you're somebody who is really steeped in the traditional way, you may be challenged in working through how this goes. You're going to want to find order when there's no order. Okay. My advice to somebody like that who's having that challenge is to just let go and just go with the flow. Okay. And trust your GM, because one of the tips here is, as the GM, you have to kind of pay attention to what's going on, and it's okay to prompt players. Ask them, hey, you haven't taken a turn first in a while. Go for it, man. Or, you know what I mean? Just pay attention to what's going on and adjust what you're doing in the round as far as what the monsters are doing, okay? To kind of tailor the round a little bit, okay? Another con to this could be if you have a lot of players, it can be tricky to manage who has taken a turn in a round. So if you have 4 or 5 or 6 players, you're going to have to find some kind of way as a GM to track that. Now, I did a video on a turn tracker that I would highly recommend watching. It's a great way to kind of like get past this if you have issues. Now, if you run 1, 2, or 3 players, I have found you don't need this. Of course, I played a million games of it, but low player count really moves along quickly, and it's easy to track, okay? That's one of the reasons why I like playing 3 players or less in my games. All right, that's probably another topic for a video, actually. Okay, yeah, and then the GM kind of has the ability to, like I said, tailor what they're doing. So there is some advice in the book about how to kind of use the monsters, like when to make your turns happen as a GM. And this can really change the feel of a round of combat. So if you decide to go first, you're controlling all those monsters. That's your task. You're controlling all those monsters on your turn. Okay. So if you go first, it's going to be very aggressive. You're going to be forcing the characters to react to you. Okay. If you go in the middle, that kind of is a good balance between kind of forcing some players to react and having the ability for the some players to take actions afterwards. All right, and you can always choose not to do anything and just let them react later in the round. Okay. If you go last, that's going to make them feel more defensive, and it's a little bit easier on the players, I have found. So if you have new players out there playing the game, if you kind of back off and you become sort of like, more defensive with your monsters and don't like lash out right away or attack first, it gives them a chance to kind of do some stuff for actions. Okay, so it's a good thing to think about. So I hope this is kind kind of helpful to you. There's not really much more I want to say about the turn order. I just kind of wanted to go over some details, give you some pointers and tips, and kind of show you the difference between the traditional setup and what Grit does. Because I think if you really get into this mindset, I think you're really going to enjoy it if you're new to the game. Okay. And if you're somebody who's steeped in the traditional way of doing things, I hope this opens up some possibilities for you of looking at how games can be run differently. All right. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video and spending time with me here. I just want to say, I hope you guys are out there enjoying your games, and as always, keep rolling those dice.